The rain lashed against the cold stone walls of Burgh by Sands, a small village in the north of England. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind that made even the bravest men shiver. Inside a modest bedchamber, King Edward I, once a towering figure of strength and authority, lay in a bed, his body ravaged by illness. His breaths were shallow, and his once piercing eyes were now dull and lifeless. Surrounding him were his loyal servants, their faces etched with worry and sorrow. They had been trying to lift him out of bed for a meal, a simple task that had become a Herculean effort. Despite their gentle hands, the old king's frail body refused to cooperate. As they struggled, his breath caught in his throat, and his eyes suddenly grew wide with a final desperate gasp, and then silence. The room froze in a moment of stillness, the storm outside seemingly pausing in respect. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, the builder of castles and the breaker of rebellions, was no more. He had passed into the realm of legend, leaving behind a kingdom that would never be the same. But the storm outside did not care for the passing of kings. It continued to rage, as if mocking the stillness inside the room. The servants, now overcome with grief, began to weep. The king's death marked the end of an era, and the beginning of a new one that would be filled with uncertainty and turmoil. In a far-off corner of the kingdom, in the comfortable and opulent surroundings of the southeast, Edward's son, the new King Edward II, was oblivious to the storm and the great change it signaled. He was more concerned with his own pleasures and the company of his closest friend, Piers Gaveston. Unlike his father, who had been a man of strength and law, Edward II was known for his unconventional interests and his preference for the company of commoners and entertainers. The new king was tall and athletic, with the regal bearing of a Plantagenet prince. But there was something different about him, something that made the people of England uneasy. He was more interested in swimming and rowing, in spending time with jesters and sailors, than in the duties of kingship. This was not the kind of king the kingdom needed, especially not with the heavy debts and the simmering discontent left by his father's reign. As the news of Edward I's death spread, the kingdom held its breath. The old king had left a legacy of conquest and law, but he had also left a legacy of debt and resentment. The Scots and the Welsh, who had been forced into submission, were waiting for a moment of weakness. The nobles, who had been pushed to the brink by the old king's uncompromising rule, were ready to challenge the new king's authority. In the days following the old king's death, Edward II took his first steps as the new monarch. His first act was to recall Piers Gaveston from exile, a decision that would set the tone for his reign and bring the kingdom to the brink of disaster. Gaveston, a Gascon knight known for his arrogance and ambition, was not just a friend to the new king. He was a favorite, a man who would soon hold more power than any noble in the land. The coronation of Edward II on February 25, 1308, was a grand affair, attended by the nobility of England and France. But it was also a day that would be remembered for the shocking display of favoritism. Gaveston, dressed in royal purple and wearing a crown of pearls, processed in front of the king and queen, a clear affront to the hierarchy of the kingdom. The nobles, already suspicious of the new king, were outraged. The storm that had marked the old king's death was now gathering again, this time within the halls of power. As the new king and his queen, Isabella, were anointed and crowned, the kingdom of England stood on the precipice of a new age. The storm was coming, and no one knew how it would end. The days following King Edward II's coronation were filled with tension and chaos. The feast that Piers Gaveston, the king's favorite, organized was a disaster. Instead of honoring the new queen Isabella, the hall was decorated with the emblems of Edward and Gaveston. This was a clear insult to Isabella and her family, who had traveled from France for the occasion. Edward spent the entire banquet talking and laughing with Gaveston, ignoring his young wife. The food was late and barely edible, adding to the embarrassment. Queen Isabella, already feeling neglected, wrote to her father, the King of France, complaining about being treated poorly and living in poverty. The coronation was a complete failure, showing everyone that Edward was more interested in Gaveston than in his duties as king. The royal court and Isabella's family were shocked by this behavior. Just a few days later, with a parliament set to meet in April, rumors spread that the powerful barons would come armed, ready to punish Gaveston for his actions. To protect himself, Edward broke the bridges over the Thames and took refuge in Windsor Castle. He had already lost the trust and support that a new king usually enjoys. When the Parliament met in April 1308, a group of barons, led by Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, presented a set of demands. They declared that loyalty should be to the crown, not the king's person, marking the first time such a distinction was made. The barons demanded that Gaveston be exiled and stripped of his earldom, saying he was harming the kingdom and causing discord between the king and his people. This was not a request from a small group, but a clear message from almost all the English barons. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury, Winchelsea, sided with the barons and threatened to excommunicate Gaveston if he did not leave England by the end of June. Only one baron, Sir Hugh Despenser the Elder, supported the king. Despite the overwhelming opposition, Edward tried to find a way to keep Gaveston close. He appointed Gaveston as the king's lieutenant in Ireland and gave him castles and manors to support himself. Edward even accompanied Gaveston to Bristol and saw him off with great ceremony. Edward II, unlike his father, did not understand the importance of consensus and compromise in English politics. Barons were sensitive to poor governance and would take action if they believed the king was failing. Edward saw Gaveston's exile as a personal attack and focused on finding ways to bring him back. In 1308, he tried to win back the barons' support by issuing reforms, such as dealing with the forced purchase of provisions for the army and the excessive powers of royal officials. In return, Gaveston was allowed back into England and regranted his earldom in August. However, Gaveston's return did not bring peace. He quickly resumed his offensive behavior, giving insulting nicknames to other earls and replacing a Lancastrian retainer with one of his own. Tensions grew, and a planned army for Scotland did not materialize. The king's officials continued to take food and supplies, causing rumors of a peasants' revolt. In early 1310, the barons refused to attend Parliament unless Gaveston was dismissed. When Edward agreed, the barons made urgent complaints about the state of the kingdom, accusing Edward of being guided by evil counselors and impoverishing the crown. They demanded that a group of 12 men be elected to reform the kingdom. The barons threatened to depose Edward if he did not heed their demands. Realizing he had no choice, Edward agreed, and on March 20th, 1310, a group of 21 ordainers was elected to carry out the reforms. Meanwhile, Edward tried to keep his distance from the ordainers by going to the Scottish borders. He stayed there until July 1311, but his campaign was unsuccessful. Robert Bruce continued to evade battle, and Edward eventually ran out of money and supplies. He returned to Westminster to find a full program of political reform in action and his enemies strengthened. While Edward was in Scotland, several important figures died, including Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, who was a respected and influential baron. Lincoln's death altered the balance of power, as his titles and lands passed to Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, making him the most powerful nobleman in England. Lancaster, who was the king's first cousin, had already supported the king during the early years of his reign, but had become a reformist due to Gaveston's behavior and the abuses in government. With his new power, Lancaster became a zealous supporter of the ordainers and played a key role in preparing the 41 Articles of Reform presented to Edward in August 1311. The 1311 ordinances were comprehensive, addressing familiar abuses like purveyance and the king's right to go to war without consulting Parliament. They placed heavy restrictions on Edward, limiting his ability to grant lands, control revenues, and appoint officials. The government was effectively taken out of Edward's hands and placed under strict control. The barons were determined to enforce these reforms, even though it was unclear how they would manage to do so against a reluctant king. The situation was tense, and the stage was set for further conflict. The year 1312 was a tumultuous one for King Edward II of England. His closest friend and advisor, Piers Gaveston, was a source of constant tension between the king and his barons. The barons, who were powerful and influential, saw Gaveston as a dangerous influence on the king. They believed he was leading the king astray and causing problems for the kingdom. They accused Gaveston of persuading the king to make bad decisions, causing conflicts with other nobles, and even taking the country to war without their consent. In November 1311, the barons demanded that Gaveston be exiled from England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and Gascony, and from any other land under the king's rule. Gaveston was forced to leave the country, but his exile was short-lived. By January 1312, King Edward had secretly recalled Gaveston, and they celebrated the birth of Gaveston's daughter, Joan. Edward openly defied the barons by restoring Gaveston to his position as earl. This defiance only made the barons angrier. They decided to take matters into their own hands. They began organizing a manhunt to capture Gaveston, using the pretense of organizing tournaments to avoid alarming the public. The barons involved included the Earls of Lancaster, Pembroke, Hereford, Arundel, and Warwick, among others. On May 19, 1312, Gaveston was captured at Scarborough Castle by the Earls of Pembroke, Surrey, and others. Pembroke, who had promised to protect Gaveston, took him into custody. However, on the night of June 9th, Pembroke made a fateful decision. He left Gaveston in a lightly guarded room in Deddington, a village in Oxfordshire, while he went to visit his wife. It was a risky move, and early the next morning, the Earl of Warwick and his men stormed the village and captured Gaveston. Warwick, who had a particular grudge against Gaveston, treated him harshly. Gaveston was forced to walk on foot, a stark contrast to the luxurious life he once led. Warwick marched him to Warwick Castle, where he was imprisoned and treated like a common criminal. A week later, the Earls of Lancaster, Hereford, and Arundel, along with other barons, gathered at Warwick Castle to decide Gaveston's fate. Despite Pembroke's protests, they held a trial and sentenced Gaveston to death. On June 19th, Gaveston was taken to Blacklow Hill, where he was brutally executed. His body was left on the ground until Dominican friars, who were close to the king, collected and prepared the remains for embalming. King Edward was devastated when he learned of Gaveston's death. He became even more determined to resist the barons' demands and never forgave his cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, for his role in the execution. This event created a deep divide among the barons, with some, like Pembroke and Surrey, feeling betrayed and becoming loyal to the king, while others, like Lancaster and Warwick, were permanently isolated from royal favor. The murder of Gaveston was a turning point in English history. It marked the first time a king's close advisor was executed in such a calculated manner, setting a dangerous precedent for violence in politics. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England for over 150 years, was now at risk of tearing itself apart, and the kingdom was on the brink of civil war. Despite the chaos at home, King Edward and Queen Isabella traveled to Paris in the summer of 1313. They were welcomed with grand celebrations, and Edward took part in a knighting ceremony for the sons of the French king, Philip IV. The visit was a welcome break from the turmoil in England, and it seemed that for a moment, the future looked brighter. Queen Isabella had given birth to a son, Edward, in November 1312, providing a measure of stability to the regime. However, the shadow of Gaveston's death loomed over the kingdom, and the tension between the king and the barons continued to simmer, ready to boil over at any moment. When Edward and Isabella returned from their trip to France in mid-July, it seemed like the worst part of their troubles was over. The king and his baronial enemies still didn't get along, especially with Hugh Despenser, who had stood by Edward and defended his favorite, Piers Gaveston, until Gaveston's death. Despenser was one of the few barons who supported the king no matter what, hoping to get land, titles, and power in return. This made him suspicious to other barons, especially Thomas of Lancaster and his allies. After months of talks with French and papal envoys, a peace agreement was finally made at Westminster in October. Edward agreed to forgive Lancaster, Hereford, Arundel, Henry Percy, Roger de Clifford, and their allies for killing Gaveston. In return, the barons agreed to forgive Despenser and other Gaveston supporters. The ordinances, which were rules to limit the king's power, weren't mentioned and no ministers were removed. Gaveston and his supporters were no longer called enemies of the king and the kingdom. It was a step forward, but not a full reconciliation. Things got better. In November, Edward got Parliament's approval to go to war with the Scots. In December, he went to France to ask his father-in-law for permission to borrow money from the Pope using the Duchy of Gascony as collateral. The Pope agreed, and in the spring, Edward received £25,000, allowing him to fund a large campaign in the north. It seemed like Edward was finally ready to continue his father's work. In June, Edward marched a massive army out of Berwick. The army was well equipped and well funded, with a wagon train stretching for 20 miles. The Earls of Gloucester, Hereford, and Pembroke, along with Hugh Despencer and Roger de Clifford, joined with thousands of knights and infantry. However, the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick, Arundel, and Surrey sent only the minimum number of soldiers they were legally required to, fearing that if Edward won in Scotland, he might turn against them in England. Edward's army marched 50 miles north from Berwick. When they reached Stirling on June 23rd, they found Robert Bruce's smaller army camped in the New Park, a wooded area. The land around the Bannockburn was boggy and full of traps that Bruce's men had set. On June 23rd, the first day of the battle, Henry de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford's nephew, challenged Robert Bruce to a one-on-one fight and was killed. The Earl of Gloucester then argued with Hereford about who should lead the vanguard. Gloucester won the argument, but was knocked off his horse and almost died. In another skirmish, English cavalry were attacked by Scottish spearmen, and many knights, including Sir Thomas Grey, were captured. The next day, the battle began again. Gloucester, still angry, charged recklessly at the Scottish infantry and was killed. The Scottish spearmen, arranged in tight formations, easily defeated the English cavalry. Edward had to be dragged from the battlefield by the Earl of Pembroke and Sir Giles d'Argentine, who was later killed when he returned to fight. Edward and a small group escaped by sea from Dunbar, leaving behind thousands of dead and dying English soldiers. The Earl of Hereford and many other high-ranking knights were captured. The loss at Bannockburn was a huge blow. Robert Bruce was now stronger than ever in Scotland and could open a new front in Ireland. Edward, on the other hand, was in a difficult position with the barons who had refused to join the campaign. Instead of a victorious king, he returned as a humbled one, facing even more challenges from his enemies. On January 2nd, 1315, Piers Gaveston's embalmed body was finally buried at King's Langley, one of Edward's favorite residences. The king had spent a lot of money on the funeral, and most of the bishops of England attended. However, Lancaster and his allies stayed away, and tensions remained high. Edward began to rely more on a new group of favorites, chief among them Hugh Despencer and his son, Hugh Despencer the Younger. They were loyal to the king and received many grants and titles, but their influence was destructive, and they were seen as a threat by the barons. From 1314 to 1317, northern Europe suffered from harsh winters and heavy rains, leading to floods and famine. Crops were destroyed and people starved. Disease spread among animals, and the military garrison near Scotland struggled. In this difficult time, the barons tried to stabilize the government by reimposing the ordinances and purging corrupt ministers. Parliament met, and Lancaster was appointed to lead the king's council, but he proved ineffective, preferring to hold his own court in the north and refusing to work with the king's favorites. The situation remained tense, and Edward's reign continued to spiral toward disaster. As the shadows of political turmoil loomed over England, King Edward II found himself teetering on the edge of a precipice. His reign, marked by favoritism and mismanagement, had alienated the very lords he relied on to uphold his rule. The Earl of Lancaster, Thomas, a powerful cousin of the king, had retreated to his northern stronghold at Pontefract Castle, a move that signaled his growing disillusionment with Edward's governance. Meanwhile, the king's new favorites, the Despensers, Hugh the Elder and Hugh the Younger, along with other courtiers like Hugh Audley and Roger Damery, grew increasingly influential and wealthy, flouting the ordinances that were supposed to limit the king's ability to grant lands and titles without parliamentary approval. Edward's attempts to buy loyalty by showering his favorites with gifts and land only deepened the rift between him and the barons. The moderate barons, who had long tried to mediate between the king and his critics, found themselves caught in a no-man's land of political chaos. The situation came to a head in 1317 when Edward marched north to confront the Scots, only to find Lancaster gathering his own forces in response. The air was thick with the threat of civil war, and even the king's closest allies, like the Earl of Pembroke, were forced to take desperate measures to maintain the fragile peace. They signed private contracts with the king's favorites, promising to protect them in exchange for a promise not to seek further favors from the king that might undermine the crown. The crisis deepened when a deranged man named John Powderham appeared before the king, claiming to be the true heir to the throne. Although Powderham was quickly hanged, His claims resonated with a populace weary of war, famine, and political instability. Edward's response to this crisis, including his fascination with a fraudulent friar and his request for a reanointing ceremony, only highlighted his growing desperation and gullibility. Despite these challenges, Edward showed brief signs of strong leadership. In 1318, he made peace with Lancaster and achieved a significant victory against the Scots in Ireland. He also stood firm against the French king's demands for personal fealty, defending the rights of his crown with a passionate speech that stunned his audience. However, these moments of strength were short-lived. The king's reliance on the Despensers, who continued to expand their power and influence, ultimately alienated both the northern lords and the marcher lords of the Welsh borders. The final straw came in 1321 when Edward granted the lordship of Gower to Hugh Despenser the Younger, a move that infuriated the marcher lords. They saw this as a clear violation of the traditional laws of the marches and a personal affront to their rights. In response, they launched a violent campaign against the Despensers, seizing their lands and possessions. The situation escalated quickly, and in August 1321, a parliament at Westminster demanded the exile of both Despensers. Queen Isabella, pregnant with their fourth child, pleaded with Edward to comply. Reluctantly, he agreed, but he vowed to avenge this humiliation. The Despensers' exile was brief. By October 1321, Hugh the Younger was back in England, and Edward was ready to strike. He besieged the castle of Bartholomew Battlesmere in Kent, a former ally who had joined the opposition. The king personally led the siege, executing Battlesmere's men and imprisoning his family. Despite the Despensers' unpopularity, Edward still had supporters among the earls, including his half-brothers and several powerful lords who feared the consequences of a full-scale civil war. As the year 1321 drew to a close, the country stood on the brink of disaster. Archbishop Reynolds of Canterbury, invoking the memory of a past civil war that had nearly torn England apart, summoned an emergency council to St. Paul's Cathedral. The realm, once a beacon of peace, now faced the very real threat of shipwreck. The stage was set for a conflict that would define the remainder of Edward's reign and the future of the kingdom.